This lecture tonight is also courtesy of the Burkes, who have given us an endowed fund so that we can have great speakers like Christopher Woodward talk. Okay. And we can bring people here and broaden the notion of what the Garden Conservancy does and who we are, and of course just gather people around who have important and interesting points of view. I also want to thank, the gardening world is a tiny world, I've discovered, and a very tiny, welcoming, lovely world. And I want to thank Dana Westring, who's also on our board, who called me up, as board members in the Garden Conservancy do, with actually good ideas, which is great. And he said, my friend Christopher Woodward is going to be in town. He's going to see the Russell Page Gardens at PepsiCo, and is that something you might want to do? And I don't think I said it at the time, but I felt like I should have said, I've been stalking Christopher Woodward for about 25 years. Maybe not. How old is the famous book that I?
2001, I think.
Okay, so not 25 years. It's always better to say it was longer. But I discovered a fantastic little book. I don't even remember where I discovered it, called In Ruins, and it really captured my imagination. The sort of cultural impact of ruins and how they've affected Western society has always been of interest to me. And this was Christopher's book, and I've read it a couple times now, and I know there's some other people in the room who've read In Ruins multiple times. And so it's been really exciting. When I was running a preservation organization in Providence, Rhode Island, I thought of building a symposium about the importance of ruins around Christopher's book, and then I moved to a different job, and so suddenly here's Christopher, which is fantastic.
Thank you.
So those of you, I think the wonderful thing about this, and you all signed up almost immediately when you heard that Christopher was here. So many of you know all about Christopher, but I just want to say that Christopher has been the director of the Garden Museum in London since 2007. He recently led a $7.5 million reconstruction and extension of the site and gardens, which we'll talk about in a little bit, creating new galleries of garden history and an education center, and setting up Britain's first archive of garden design. The museum reopened on May 22nd. Christopher's a historian of architecture and gardens, two things that are very, very deeply important to me. He was previously director of the Holborn Museum of Art in Bath, England, and a curator at what I'm sure everybody's favorite museum in this room, the Sir John Soane Museum. He's also served as a board member of the Heritage Lottery Fund, the UK's national body responsible for funding both built and national heritage, which we should definitely have in this country. His book, In Ruins, in 2001 was shortlisted for the National Prize for Young Writers, and he's just completed a study of the history of nostalgia, which is something, of course, that also very clearly brushes up against gardens and why we create and maintain gardens. Christopher's personal obsession, which I found out, I never knew this about you, is swimming. And he helped raise funds for the Garden Museum project. He's done swims of the Hellespont.
Hellespont in it, yeah.
The Hellespont. I don't know anything about swimming. Strait of Gibraltar, the River Thames from Oxford to London, and this fall, 30 kilometers within the Arctic Circle.
Yeah, just done that. Just come back.
I didn't read this before I got up here, and I'm thinking like, so we have this evening to try to convince him not to do that. Each swim inspired by botanist John Tradescant, whose dates, as you know, were 1580 to 1638, whose life is the inspiration of the Garden Museum. Christopher.
Thank you very much, Jason. I think, in a sense, you realise things aren't coincidences, but the whole point about ruins is that they're where architecture and gardens meet. And when I was a student, I loved going to look at French buildings with their perfect stereotomy and immaculate staircases, and I found myself becoming more and more intrigued by buildings covered in plants. And there's also this fact that plants like ruins and ruins like plants. They're protected by plants. But we're gonna do this as a conversation because it's such a big subject, and it's really good for James to bring it back to questions he has. But what I really want to talk about is what happens to gardens through their lifetimes and in their afterlives. And so this is not a talk about the physical conservation of gardens, which is a subject in itself. And my first jobs were working in physical conservation. I was in architecture and landscape, where you're fighting to prevent physical changes to a garden, a building, to trees. This is really about two questions. Certain gardens, when change is part of their character, particularly a flower garden, how do we, if you like, pass on to the future what inspires us about those gardens? And secondly, when a garden must go, if it has to go, how does it live on in our minds? So that's what I wanted to talk about. And thank you to Trevor Botter and Dana Westring for, I've had this journey to Virginia, and I'm here really on the trail of two landscape designers, Humphrey Repton, because next autumn is the bicentenary of his death, and Russell Page. We have, I'm going to talk a bit about Russell Page's archive, and we have a Russell Page Council, and each of them, both Repton and Page, were deeply preoccupied by the afterlife of their work, but in quite subtle ways. I mean, actually, as you mentioned, Sir John Soane, I spent 5 years working there, and I actually think there's something quite unhealthy about that kind of afterlife. I mean, it's a work of genius. I spent many happy hours in the evening cataloguing drawings, admiring the design, but it's very much a mausoleum to the self. And as you may know, when he died, he instructed that the house be altered as little as possible. So his armchair is by the same fireplace, the same clock ticking, the pictures hanging in the same place. And there are no views out onto the park, into the city. The only light comes from skylights, and he opened it to the public while he was alive. And I went back to an event which reenacted the opening of the bathtub, because he commanded his lawyer that 50 years after he died, a bathtub full of documents should be opened. And they reenacted this with actors. And it was actually full of bitterness, and it was actually quarrels, recriminations, his disappointment in his children. And when I've moved into gardens, one of the things I just really enjoy is a more fertile relationship with passing gardens on, which is very much what this talk is about, how gardens become something else, and how we never quite own a garden. We have it and we pass it on to people. And the first person we're going to show a short film, 3-minute clip of her, Penelope Hobhouse. I knew her before working in gardens, and she was just leaving a garden called Bettiscombe, which was a beautiful garden. And she was, and I remember her saying, she said, look, Christopher, you don't know that you don't get this because you're not a gardener, but there's a point when it's time to move on. A garden's over. It's time to either change it, start again. And she said, look, the hedges are slightly too big. And then, I said, Penny, sorry. I said, what are you going to? Should I just put that? I said, she said, I'll just take a few cuttings and I won't come back. And I just, that was such a different attitude to the works we make. Is that okay? So let's start with some. So this talk is it's not really that much about the museum, because I didn't just want to, you'll come and visit. It's kind of a series of case studies about gardeners. And so this is where these are Russell Page's pencils. And I'm really fond of them. And his niece gave them to us. And James, I'm like James, a curator by background, and the pencils tell a story. I haven't been, it's called Tony Monero's, the steakhouse does it still exist? No, well, I would have gone there if it still existed. That's what I like to do. I would have gone there. And there's something about picking up his pencils which take you close to a person. But the museum, very quickly, the museum is that church, pictured here in the 18th century, on the banks of the Thames, next door to Lambeth Palace, Parliament. And in the 1970s, it was in 1638, John Tredescant was buried here. He was gardener to King Charles I. His son, also called John, became gardener to King Charles II. And they are buried in a famous tomb. And that tomb is the reason the church was rescued from ruin in the 1970s by a lady called Rosemary Nicholson. It was abandoned, about to be demolished. And what we have now done is to build a structure within that church, which we've restored. It's really great to have a building that works, lit, working, heated, environmentally controlled. But we've built inside this structure for the collection of garden history, which I'm going to just give you glimpses because to keep to time, which stands independently of the old building. This is the selection that's William Robinson's cloak, Gertrude Jekyll's desk, her photograph album. This is the collection of tools. We put the shed in this quite symbolic position. Inside the shed, you watch films about people in their sheds. For children, And then a room, those are you glimpse the shells in Tredescant's portrait. This was a room which recreated the museum that Tredescant established in the 1630s. In that, in the picture there, you can see one of the objects his son brought back from Virginia, a ball club. This is a piece of quite international significance. So they were collectors and gardeners. And also within the museum, that's their tomb. I'm just going to go back to one to show you. Was the archive. This is the archive on the right, which I'm going to talk about, where we're collecting the papers and ephemera of garden designers. Then you step out into the extension. That's the original lid of Tredescant's tomb, which has been clad with bronze. And around a new garden designed by Dan Pearson, you have the learning spaces and the cafe. And you can see that it's been inserted within the historic site. That's the garden just planted. That's from the road. That's the side of the cafe. But this all happened because of this tomb. And this is a drawing that was commissioned by Samuel Pepys. Samuel Pepys, he lived at a time when it was believed that whatever we build will vanish into dust. There was no such thing as architectural conservation, and he had his own private paper museum of London, where he would commission artists to draw what he had liked, admired in the city. And he sent 2 artists to draw the tomb. And this is our ruin sequence, because carved into that tomb are the earliest images in British art of ruins as a metaphor for vanitas, as memento mori. It would have been a skull, now it was a tumbling classical ruin. And the poem on top tells the story, ends with a line of 2 gardeners transplanted to a paradise. It's very beautiful. And that word transplanted, I think, is at the heart of this, the idea that they change form and become something else. And the imagery is actually derived, this is a really bad slide, of a painting by Van Rysdale called The Jewish Cemetery. It's not specifically a Jewish cemetery, it's really a capriccio of different cemeteries. And the idea is that the polished tomb, the monument, will crumble according to God's will as change is benign. And this was what that time believed. That painting is in Detroit. And one of the most startling experiences is looking at that painting. It was donated to the Detroit Institute in 1928 by a man called Julian Haas, who was a banker, a philanthropist. And at a time when the city was chugging with wealth and towers of marble and mosaic rising, and he can't have imagined that when you visit 50 years later, you step out from that painting and you see the vastest panorama of ruins in the developed world. It's quite an astonishing, and it's also, I think, a lesson in to what degree we can control the future. Yeah. That's so. Now, clunked onto that poem. Does you know what they are, don't you? Who know? They're Gertrude Jekyll's boots. Yeah. Now, the story of Gertrude Jekyll's boots, I think, is quite an illustration of the haphazardness of Gardner's posterity. And somebody called Nancy Allen visited Munstead some years after she died and asked for a souvenir. And her nephew, who was called Timmy, handed Nancy Allen the boots. And she came back. She was a landscape architect in New York. And they came back to New York. And then 20 years later, she went back to London. And she went to the Tate because they were painted famously as a kind of portrait of Jekyll's character by William Nicholson. And the Tate didn't want the boots. And then she went to the Royal Horticultural Society and offered them the boots. And they said, we don't want the boots either. And she was put on the train to Godalming, which is where Jekyll lived and where the boots stand quite happily in the museum there. Yeah. But I think I think gardeners by nature, the window opens, the day ahead, we're all living in the future. We think about the future by nature. Nature is thrusting forward. And I think when I first started writing about why isn't there an archive of garden design, there are many practical reasons, but one of them is that perspective of gardeners. We move on. We think we don't. I met so many architects, not just Sohn, who were still, the bookmark is still in the place it was in 1984. The early masterpiece is the model on the table, and it's kind of, you leave after lunch and you're feeling a bit sad. It's feeling the life has stopped, and so the downside of this is that we're not as good at posterity as preserving our records, gardeners don't build museums to themselves. They just don't. So, and I remember once we asked a panel of writers and designers to pick the best contemporary garden of the last 10 years. It was supposed to be British, but they, being disobedient writers, they chose a garden in France called Le Jardin Plume in Normandy, which is that perfect balance of design, horticulture, made out of an old farmhouse and cider orchard by a couple called Patrick and Sylvie Cabell. It's a masterpiece. There's a book about it. And I wrote to them and I said, we've decided to tell you that you're the best gardener of the decade. And I took the train to Rouen, and Sylvie Cabell, her English wasn't great, she had bags under her eyes, and she said she'd had a bad night's sleep. And it was because this Museum of Gardens had told her that her garden was, if you like, accessioned.
Done. Right, done.
And as if we were putting it under a glass case.
Yeah.
And I found that quite striking too. She felt as if she had been mummified, but at the same time, the paradox within this is that we love the lost garden, we love the abandoned garden. There's a moment, I think, in the first year after abandonment, when a garden's at its most beautiful, it becomes a kind of haze of itself. And I put this in just because I was staying with my family in Devon, and each day we cycled past this house, and the moment my sisters and brother and families and my mother set off in their cars packed, I went straight here and I climbed over the wall. Because it was almost a lust to see this garden, these pendulous grapes, these unpeeling artichokes. It was this desire to see this lost garden, which I think is somewhere within us. So I think that's a sort of fracture I want to explore as we talk, James. And that said, this talk isn't about I think there's always a reason not to preserve a garden. So after the Second World War, the National Trust took on 4 gardens, including Sissinghurst, as gardens, not as houses. And now, if you picture the conversation, there will be all sorts of grey-faced men pointing out why you shouldn't do it. There's the philosophical, how can we keep this Vita's garden alive? There's the philosophical argument, there's the financial arguments, but nothing in the end, whatever I'm going to talk about, compares with the spatial experience of a preserved garden. Its relationship with the landscape, its relationship with the house. And so I can't imagine my gardening education without the physical preservation of certain gardens, whether it's Sissinghurst or those 18th century gardens. These are photographs in our collection taken just before Vita's death. That's her last article for The Observer saying goodbye. And this is a photograph taken by a very, very good Edwin Smith. He was commissioned to take her portrait, and the day he arrived at Sissinghurst, he was told that she had died in the night. And he put her boots on the chair and took that rather beautiful photograph. You can preserve a garden. This is Castle Howard. This is a garden of grass, trees, water, and you can...
Temples.
Yeah. You can preserve that. Temples. I had tea with Alejandro from Madhu, which is very much the comparator with Great Dixter in terms of a succession. And you know this, but at Great Dixter, Fergus Garrett, because he was speaking here, I daunted following the Fergus, who's a wonder, where you have effectively a succession over 15 years. So I won't.
But I think one of the things that inspired me to focus on preservation, there are 2 things. One is it's what our organization does. It's one of our, in addition to education, we are sort of unpeeling and discovering and creating an approach to preservation, or not. And it became very clear to me, and I think because of the long experience that my organization has had with the notion of preservation, that there isn't one approach. And this is why I thought that, as you and I sort of teased out what we would talk about.
Yeah.
But one of the things that before we go on from Great Dixter, I just wanted to say was that Fergus said very clearly, and I see these gorgeous photographs, and when I met Fergus in Atlanta and he was speaking for us, he said, if we just preserve Great Dixter and aspic, and we just take the plant list and keep replanting it, we have destroyed what Great Dixter was. It was a garden of experimentation. And it struck me that there is an entirely different notion of how you take the spirit of a place and with Great Dixter. And although I don't think he of course has these fantastic photographs where he shows how much it does change, but it changes around a series of assumptions and a series of beliefs.
Of values and
what Christopher was about, yes.
And attitudes and
Yes.
But the thing about Great Dixter as well, James, is it shows how hard it is as well, because you have this genius Fergus, who spent 15 years with this. And I think Great Dixter, Kifsgate is the other one, where you, if people know Kifsgate, where you have 3 generations of the same family, where there's a kind of, what's the word, an understanding that's very gently passed on. And I think it's much harder to wring it out in, and Alejandro with Bob Dash, I think it's quite hard to force that onto a place in a more structured institutional relationship. But Great Dixter, I mean, and shows, Alejandro said earlier, it shows that it can be done.
It can be done, and I would just point out that, you know, because I think that the Conservancy, as we investigate this and as we sort of create the canon, if you will, in the United States, one of our gardens, which is Hollister House, is a similar idea, which is that George Shelkoff, who created the garden, now has a gardener who he works with very intimately, and so you start to learn what the vision, how to reenact the vision of the creator, but not in a rigid way, in the way, because of course the other thing that keeps these gardens from becoming the Soane Museum is that gardens fight back against that all the time. They prevent you from being rigid because they're living things.
And they have, I mean, and one thing that's exactly, and you can't. You couldn't do it even if you wanted to, because of you're dealing, as you say, you're dealing with organic material. It's also, I think, one thing that's really important is the word intent. And John Sayles, who was head of gardens at the National Trust, wrote a very brilliant article on how to conserve flower gardens, and he says it's so important to know the intent. And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about with archives, because archives tell you intent, what the intention was, not just what it looked like. I mean, as a counter to this, James, I've put in another garden, which is Derek Jarman's garden, which the filmmaker, Fisherman's Hut, lonely spit of shingle on the coast of Britain. In the background, a nuclear power station glows. In the foreground, this rough sea, washed up fishermen's boats, metal debris.
So just flotsam and jetsam
Flotsam
everywhere.
and jetsam. And he made this garden, which is a celebration of that. And there's a book of photographs by Howard Suley. That's John Donne's poem, The Sun. On the end, and Howard Suley we commissioned, if you like, a set of photographs, some of which are incredibly intimate because they show him not dying, but in his last, there's a beautiful photograph of him. His last journey was to Giverny, to visit Giverny, which he'd never done. But I put this in because I interviewed his partner who inherited it, and he said, "I feel imprisoned by the photographs." Because right now, not right now because it's 10 o'clock in Britain, this afternoon, there will have been 2 architectural students from Norway or something on the doorstep holding the book. It's such an iconic book. And when you garden, this physical instinct, you can't garden with, it's a physical, your brain goes into your fingers, as someone said. And so, and that is a question, what to do with a site such as that, and how to, I just thought that was a good, he said I felt imprisoned by the photographs.
Yes, and it's just like the experience you mentioned before with the French gardener who had bags under her eyes.
Yes.
Because you know what we want gardens to be is spontaneous.
Yes.
And this was, you know, this is as much
such a famous
collection.
picture, isn't it? Yeah.
It's a fantastically famous picture. I've always wanted to visit it with the book in my hand and, you know, like knock on the door and terrify the guy inside. But and in fact, Fergus and I talked about it. I said, you know, can we ever get to see, you know, Derek Jarman's garden? He said, yeah, I know exactly where it is. And he said, you know, the Derek's partner who owns the property now probably won't come out of the house. He said, but I'll walk you around. But it is a problem here because this is also sort of a bricolage, sort of like, you know, or collage of found objects, and that's meant to sort of go on. But how do you do that? I mean, especially with an artist here, I think that
it's so much about being on the edge of vanishing as well. Its whole. My secret, it's not very secret because I'm going to tell you, is one day I'd like us to acquire that house actually and call it Garden Museum on the Beach. And no, but as a sort of, because I actually think, to be serious, that's something. It's been in films, it's been in books. It's a really important work of art for the nation, and I think that should be a retreat or something. But that place, the building, the garden, I actually think should be preserved. It's of such significance.
All over Great Britain, conservators are breathing a great sigh of relief because they'll work on it for the rest of their careers. It's trying to keep it together.
But it's and in case I forget, Bev Chatto told me the story that, which is this point I'm going to talk about the elusiveness of memories, how quickly we lose them. She would go to Glyndebourne with Christopher Lloyd, and they would have a picnic before. And one day he said, "Let's go for a picnic on Dungeness." And they drove past that house and said, "I wonder whose garden that is." And they knocked on the door, and Derek Jarman came out. and the three of them had tea. And those are probably the three most influential gardeners in Britain. And no one's written it down.
Yeah.
So this conversation happened, and I'd love to know what they talked about.
Yeah.
But no one wrote it down, therefore we don't know, which is one of my points tonight. What next we have? So, as I said, I was at Oak Spring as a guest at the foundation, and Mrs. Mellon acquired 4 red books in addition to other Repton material. And I think you might know these red books. Effectively, Repton presented his designs as a book of sketches interspersed with text. And what happens is you see the farmhouse there, and the client is told, you lift a flap and gone. Do you see at the bottom? It's become a lake and a gazebo. So there are these before and after views. But the point I put this in is that Stephen Daniel, the great expert, says the point Repton followed capability Brown. Brown contracted. He had hundreds of men. He made millions of pounds. He made his money by making the garden. Repton made his money by charging by the day. And he was deeply aware that clients didn't do what he wanted to. He was very aware of the fragility of reputation. He finds himself defending Brown only 20 years later from misperceptions of his work. But also, Repton saw these red books as his posterity. They are Humphrey Repton, and they include in the text not just specific design advice, but also his theories on gardens. So Repton, deeply aware of the ephemerality of the materials in which he was working.
His drawings of the gardens, his books were actually in a way more important than the gardens themselves.
Yes,
in a way. Yeah.
I think that's Stephen Daniel's view, is that they and he would, particularly when he had less work. I mean, Repton was quite a melancholic person. He'd been a failed businessman, a failed artist. He began landscape gardening in his mid-40s, and he was quite an introspective person. He wrote quite sad memoirs. He was a doubtful person, and he was very aware. Yes, he was interested in Dutch memento mori. So exactly, Repton wanted these to be his monument is perhaps not the right word, but
yes.
his and this is as you can see, this is one of the red book in our collection. It's designs for changing the house. And the great thing is that we all become like kids when we hand all these scholars. We gathered in Mrs. Mellon's library, and we were all like kids because we lift the flap and we're all giggling.
You get to turn the page, which no one else gets to do, which is fantastic. Yes.
Heroine ahead, which is Beatrix Farrand. This is one of the watercolours from Gertrude Jekyll's book, Gardens of Old England, which we've tried to buy more than once. It's by James Elgood, who captured better than anyone the blueness of view of structure. But Jekyll, this puzzles to me, and I don't know the answer, as to why Jekyll was so careless of her collection, her belongings, her drawings. This watercolour was painted to show her admiration for the 17th century topiary, but equally her enjoyment of the new head gardener's plantings, which you can see. So a very understood balance between old and new in Jekyll's life. And this is, having failed to buy that, this is very bad colouring. We bought one of the watercolours by Helen Allingham of the great border at Munstead, which was a spectrum. Jekyll, as you know, trained as a painter before failing eyesight in her 40s, moved her into garden design, and just her returning to her child love of making gardens. And what I think Jekyll understood is that a painting, unlike a photograph, can compress into one frame moments in time. So the planting is several weeks of change, perhaps a month or two of plantings, in that not everything would have flowered at the same moment. That's a view of that's Jekyll's photograph. And one thing that we acquired recently was an album. We bought it from a dealer in New York called Hans Kraus, who was very patient so we could fundraise. And it shows views of still lives in the studio she built for herself, and sort of old England views. So she was an antiquarian. She was interested in old things. And that is the only album of Jekyll's in Britain. There are 5 scrapbooks at Berkeley, including her drawings. This is the only drawing we have, a planting plan. And so you may know this story, but this is Beatrix Farrand visiting William Robinson, whose cloak you saw earlier. But and I'm grateful to Trevor and Dana for as a thank you gift for visiting the museum. They gave me Jane Brown's excellent biography of Farrand. And the point here is that at Repoint in Maine, she built really a prototypical garden museum. It became a foundation after her husband's death in the 1940s, but from the 1930s, it was becoming, if you like, the beds were being ordered for education. A visitor centre was built called the Garden Club Room. She put her books in one room. In the blue room was the portrait of André Le Notre, the Prince of French Gardens. Elsewhere, there were portraits of her heroes and heroines, Jekyll, Olmsted. And she had a room for lectures. And as you may know, partly as a consequence of a fire in 1947, as a widow, she was selling her jewellery to pay for maintaining this foundation. In 1955, in a series of, she announced her decision to sell it, and a van came from across America, and her drawings. Well, the point is, she was the one. A friend of hers called Nancy Milliken rescued Jekyll's drawings from a jumble sale. They were being thrown away, and so. But what I found really, that was the normal thing. You didn't. But what's really startling is why Farron did this. She was an original person. I can't think, but being Edith Wharton's niece and travelling companion and a friend of Henry James, must have made you aware of the slipperiness of meaning over time. How we very quickly peel into anecdotes after we die. We become scattered anecdotes people. Her husband, importantly, was a historian of the Constitution, so he worked with documents. He was the first director of the Huntington Library. So in the same way that he learned to garden from her, they must have discussed the value of documents. And of course, that collection across the United States to go to the landscape school at Berkeley. But I was talking about, Paula Dietz was written about this, and it's in her book of gardens. There's this quite startling thing. On the van was the nameplate of Repoint. And she sold the house and she asked for the garden to be, and she turned her back on the garden. Now, what happened actually is that a man called Mr. Savage, who was on her board, who was the son of an innkeeper, and Paula writes about this beautifully, he took the garden, he took the azaleas, the rhododendrons, he came with his daughter who she did a colour chart of the rhododendrons, and they remade the garden opposite his inn as a Japanese garden. And so this is, as we move on to how gardens live on, this is our first proposal, if you like, which is they live on through plants. Gardens become other gardens through the transportation of plants.
So at Repoint, they moved the azaleas, reconfigured them
into a new garden.
Yeah. But they were essentially
the same plants.
They were preserving fragments, if you will, right? As raw materials, sort of architectural elements almost.
But apparently, she would drive past and stop and look at this new life coming to the garden. And I think this, I won't go into it, but we had, when we set out to build our project, it was going to be built to preserve Lady Salisbury's Knot Garden. And then because of the planning discussion, our proposals were rejected. We had to redesign the scheme. So the new education building came over the edge of the garden, and we thought, shall we move it? So we did designs for moving it, and then it just felt like a badge. You just moved it. It lost and so it was not our intention, but that garden was then dispersed. So every plant in that garden was taken by volunteers, by the park community, and rather sweetly, do you see that holly spiral? One of our volunteers who had become ill, she had moved to an industrial city in the north to go home, and her son and our gardener took the holly spiral in the van to Lancashire. And I couldn't find the photograph, but she sent me a photograph growing completely incongruously in her back garden in Chesterfield. So I feel personally slightly pleased but I think this is really about influence, because gardening is about friendship, and the giving of plants is friendship and influence. Beth Chatto made a list of all the people she had inspired or who inspired her and for our exhibition, and you can see that she kept adding names. That's in our archive. And so I want to talk about archives, because I think having an archive of garden design is not an original idea. What's difficult is making it happen. And we did an exhibition about Beth, and an archive is defined by not being the end product. It's the script of the film, it's the letter which explains a garden, it's the sketch for the painting.
It's the pencils.
It's the pencils, it's things which inform the process. So the garden is the garden, and what we have is 50 years of, this is Beth on our honeymoon in Corsica, it's beautiful, yeah? 50 years of photographs of diaries. This is when in her early 40s she began the garden. And we did this exhibition, then we took it all back to our house in Essex, and it all went back in this cupboard. And I thought, this can't be, she's 86, we've got to do something. And so an archive is expensive, the kit, the archivist, but we've done it. That's her first garden at Chelsea, which people remember so vividly because it was so different to everything else. That's 1977. That's, of course, her dry garden, the one which only on one day, which she still regrets, it was watered one day in its life. But these are the papers which have come to the museum, and I just love opening her diaries. Now, with an archive, there are all reasons. An archive has got to have an emotional impulse, because if archivists are excellent, but they will always tell you every week, is it big enough? Will you what's your, you have to answer all these questions, but at the end, instinctively, you've just got to do it. Francis Bacon talked about antiquities, he said, are the objects that have by chance escaped the shipwreck of time. But actually, before the shipwreck happens, you have to decide what cargo to take. You have to take the cargo off the ship. And even though I know that
you have to be looking and thinking about it and planning ahead.
But at some point, you've got to get in the van and you've got to go and take it.
Right.
And well, obviously, there's a by legal agreement with her. But the point is,
you've got to ask for it.
If you don't do it,
right.
We've all seen this within months. We've all been to the houses of people who have died, and the disorder. A lot of it's about meaning, having the time so she can sit down and explain what these. I really find that people beyond the age of 80, it's very hard to have 85 a kind of informed, self-reflective dialogue on their careers. So it's a lot about. I'm going to come on to Barbara Robinson and Rosemary Ferry, but it's a lot about. So this is Janet Jack, who unknown, but she did the landscape for a very visionary housing scheme in the 1970s, which was the first social housing project to be registered. And she died about 18 months ago, but this is us with her drawings, and we've recorded her, and it's our first online module for students. So you have to what I mean is you have to sort of get on with it and just say, let's do it.
And can I just say for a moment, because I think that's a fantastic photograph, if we could just go back to that. Because it's not only about the documents, it's about the voice and the communication of the person. And
yes.
When the first event that I came to here at the Garden Conservancy, and sort of my first sort of really cogent, or it seemed cogent Garden Conservancy moment, I was with Susan Lowry and we were talking to Fred Rich, and Fred Rich said, can gardens survive beyond the time of their, the reason we're having this discussion tonight, can a garden survive beyond the vision of its original creator? And I was down in Bucks County with some friends of the Conservancy and riding around, and the garden didn't make a lot of sense to me until I got into the little golf cart and drove around with the people who have created it. And then suddenly it came into closer focus.
Yes.
And so I think that it's not just about the drawing, but it's about the interpretation by the creator.
It's priceless, and I mean and I've done that thing where I could tell you that the wing of a house was added in 1814 and is clearly inspired by a visit to Pompeii,
right.
But I don't know that. I'm surmising that. And I mean, I was at PepsiCo on Monday and I had tea with Donald Kendall, who was the guy who ran PepsiCo and made that garden. And it's always said, because I've been told this, that he met Page through a client called Augustine Edwards, and I asked him, this is, no, that's not true. I met him in California, and he told me a completely different story. Now, he's 96. Is that not true either? Okay, well, this is my point. Yeah, but he said it wasn't. Yeah. Well, no, but Susan, I suppose this is my point, is that very quickly people tell you different. So I went to a. Okay, so that's my point. That's a perfect illustration, because we've all done this. People tell you different things, don't they?
Yep.
Unless you talk about it in time, so you don't know. So I went to a party, last night, and all 10 people would write round a different record of that party, wouldn't they, Tom? Yeah, I mean, and each one is true, but I mean, that's how our memories work. I mean, basically, we forget. There's a very good book by someone called Daniel Schachter, who's a neurosurgeon in Boston. We forget everything half of everything within 24 hours. And of course, this is the great challenge with gardens, because, of course, gardens continue to unfold. We were just, Pamela Gorbanali from our preservation department and I were just out at the Chase Garden, which is one of the Conservancy's gardens. And, the woman who created the garden, when a tree got too big, she just cut it down. Yes.
Because it was constantly a work in progress, and so it's not even like a house where you can go back and say, I think this is what I saw, because it's too much about spontaneity for it to be able to be preserved in the same way that we think about architectural preservation.
And I want to show some pictures. I mean, because I've got some people saying, I want to show some pictures of how you, if you like, how you record that spontaneity, that. Just Jellicoe, we just saw, this is John Brooks, this is Hugh Johnson, this is a lovely draft of his book on, he has gardening is at the same time the most complex and demanding of the arts, and the only one universally practiced without training by something men and women. But what I love about this is it shows his first thoughts for his book. You get that, I think, as you admire someone, I like Virginia Woolf a lot, and the more you read it, the more you're keener to see what was in her wastebasket.
Yes.
There's something about the comment in the margin, the text, well, she didn't send text, would have been the little sketches that give us an insight
the
into
mistakes.
the mistakes. Yes. Now, I want to do Russell Page quickly because so this is back to Russell Page's pencils.
West Palm Beach. Fantastic.
Sorry.
West Palm Beach.
Yes. Because he stayed in people's. He, as you know, he spent a lot of his time staying. This is him at the. This is him at the Frick Collection, and when that debate, if that's the right, happened recently, the archive had a particular role to play, because not only do you have
the Conservancy,
as to the Conservancy, so this is the drawing, but there was also his specification, very detailed pages, and it clearly showed the thought and professionalism that had gone into the making of that garden.
Which, of course, without that drawing, would have been lost.
Do you think so?
Well, no. I just mean that without that drawing, you couldn't have made that argument. You couldn't have traced.
Yes.
Couldn't have traced his thought process.
Someone said to me, "Oh, it's just a sketch," but it's not just a sketch. Here's the here's his detailed specification. There's a discussion with the contractor where he's telling to adjust the paving by 3 inches.
Right.
It's a garden that he took. I mean, Page. These are so. The story of Russell Page's archive. So the other thing that made 10 years ago, I saw Russell Page's archive at a place in Belgium called Kampthout. And a man called Robert de Belde, who was a great collector of books and a diamond dealer, he was a close friend of Page. And Page, who was very aware, he spoke really of how what survives of you is trees, water, rocks and sculpture in his work. But he gave his archive to Robert de Belde, who was going to build a pavilion and a study centre with the books and the papers. And I saw, Mr. de Belde lost his money, sadly, then he died. And I saw them scattered around, well, not quite scattered, but in a barn on the family's estate. And by a very complex process, really put in play by Madison Cox, in order to make an exhibition happen, the drawings have been deposited at the museum, and through a foundation based in New York, we've done a basic catalogue of 3,500 drawings. And I show this because I think it's again about the intent. This is one of his masterpieces, which is Villa Silvio Pellico outside Turin. And this is Page's photograph. This is a great garden which is preserved, and we have a Russell Page Council. Charles, hello, who's a member of the and we went there, and it's beautifully. And one thing that is astonishing about Page is the deep fondness. He died over 30 years ago, but Charles came to our meeting in London, and people are talking about him as if he had just left the room. It's really quite moving that somebody can be that, and I'm very proud of this project, because the next phase of funding is going to pay for a proper study of 25 projects. I want to have the sketches explain the process, to have him treated as you might expect to pick up a book about an 18th century architect, where we look at the documents, we reproduce the sketches. But it's also, this is Page at PepsiCo, some photographs his niece gave us. And when he planted that, he was planting these trees. They were very, very small trees. He died 4 years after he began that garden, so it would have been a landscape of, you see it in the bottom left. Susan, you obviously know, and I think he was looking back to his early work designing a public landscape for the Festival of Britain in 1951, but things get added. So his niece gave us these photographs. This is him as a young man in the 1930s with his second wife in Switzerland as a boy at school. And what I'm really excited about is she also gave to us, because we built his manuscript for the sequel to Education of a Gardener, which he never finished and can't be published. It's not ready enough to be published, just as it needs explaining, it needs commentary. This is a passage I won't read to you, but it's a recollection of his first years at boarding school and the role plants played and his art classes. And so that is something to me incredibly precious. This is him on evergreens. This is more manuscripts, which I assume he wrote on his travels. And at PepsiCo, I was able to find the place where he used as an office. So we found that spot where he had a little drawer for his drawings, because he used it as a base as he travelled around the United States. And then that's an office archive, but I came across as a scrap of paper which should have been thrown away, and it's written 12th night 1982. So he was 2 years before. I write looking out over a green winter landscape, beyond more pasture land he's in the north of Italy, or Switzerland, beyond the lavender reaches of the lake, so much painted by Turner. Reminds me of a Dürer he had seen in the Hirsch collection in Basel. Over a steep wood hill to the left lies the church, the great Baroque church. Paracelsus was born at the mill house here and now lies in an unknown grave in Salzburg. I have been filled all day with melancholy thoughts of my father, a melancholy man to his old age. He lived to be 96. like Mr. Edwards and Mr. Kendall, Page's clients. 20 years younger though I am, I find my memory already confused. What I need, I do not find. My front brain wanders shiftlessly. No will, no concentration seems possible. By some association, I remember Mozart, born in Salzburg, to find an unknown grave in Vienna 35 years later. His music reaching its greatest heights in the last troubled year of his life. Against many odds, he was faithful to what he was. Now, that shouldn't have survived, that bit of paper, but I find that incredibly moving. And that last line, against many odds, he was faithful to what... That's Page talking about himself.
Himself, right.
And that's just a scrap of paper which somebody didn't throw away. Now, we've got one heroine this is a photograph from Barbara's book, and this is, I'm going to rattle on because otherwise you've got to go to dinner and stuff, but this is Barbara's biography of Rosemary Very, and you know the book and how popular it's been. So I suppose the point is here, more biography, and at the right time, because Barbara wrote the book, what, 10 years after she died? You began about slightly less than 10 years, which is the right moment. And these are some of the photographs that I think you can recognise both people. The favourite... Oh, sorry, I'll show you again. That's there we are. Yeah. But then what Barber also did, which is so important, she placed, with Rosemary's archive of drawings at the New York Botanic Garden, she placed all the transcripts of her interviews, which are there as a resource. There are dozens of interviews, which are there as a resource for future historians. I'm going to skip on just to... So the writing of biography at the right time is critical to the future understanding us, and to take that work that Barbara did. This is an Andrew Lawson photograph, isn't it? Yeah, so Andrew was talking at the museum last night, so I missed him, and he's just... Oh, sorry, one book we acquired. There was a great sale. A man called Mr. Becker bought all her library. We, partly with Barbara's help, we outbid him on just one book, which was... It wasn't... and it was her favourite book of knot design, and what was rather nice about it, on that page, which was a post-it label, which we've had to remove for conservation reasons. But it was her post-it, and it tells us that was the inspiration for her garden, the knot garden at Barnsley.
But importantly, the post-it survives. It's removed from this now.
I don't know.
One would hope.
I might have used it.
Yeah.
Andrew Lawson, so he's just deposited his archive of slides at the museum. And importantly, Andrew had 300,000 slides, and he threw away 90% himself. Wow. No, but you mustn't, the point is 300,000 slides, it's impossible.
Right. You
could never catalogue them. I was going to say it's like a Borges story where he writes the story about making a one-to-one map of the world, and you never finish it. And Alejandro said it's like the Collier brothers. I don't know what that means, but that might be. So the point is we have 30,000 slides, and that's plenty, and that gives us a perfectly informed understanding of Andrew's work, and he's chosen them himself.
And, importantly, right, so he is actually the curator, the editor of his own collection, which is very important.
But we're having a dialogue. He's asked a question. We're talking about what of his kit we're going to keep, because the point about Andrew, he was a doctor. His life was transformed by the flood in Florence in 1966. He was studying medicine in Oxford, and he was one of those young people who got on a van, drove to Florence to help rescue things from the Uffizi from the flood. Then he became a painter and then a photographer. But what makes his work so... This is his social history book, but what makes his work so exceptional, such as Hidcote, is he says, I always begin with the intent of the garden. What is the garden trying to be? And so those slides, and Andrew chose 30 for his talk on Tuesday, which each tell a story. Now, we're going to show a quick film very quickly, because photography takes you to a certain point, but what we've also begun to do is, it's just 2.5 minutes long. It's just a clip of a film we made about Penelope Hobhouse. We see Gertrude Dugan in her garden, and how much we'd give for 30 seconds of stuttering film footage, wouldn't we? Of how did she speak, how did she move? And so we've made 6 films, each funded, and this is just a short clip from the one about Penelope.
The garden gives me such an enormous amount of pleasure all the time. Gardening really took me over. No question about my passion for gardening was fueled by the fact that I wasn't in a particularly happy marriage, obviously, because I then left. And it meant it was my sort of escape, which I think it has always remained, because it is a sort of therapy. You avoid all difficult things by gardening. The telephone went one day. This man called Steve Jobs rang, and he said, well, actually, I've got 2 gardens for you to look at, but in the immediate future, I want the garden around my house down in Palo Alto. And he arrived on his rollerblades and right into the restaurant and sat down. And we, of course, instead of just being people staying, we suddenly became VIPs as well, because we had the wonderful Steve. Design is a funny word, is what he said. Some people think design means how it looks, but of course, if you dig deeper, it is really how it works. And that, I think, is quite a sort of fundamental thing about garden design, because gardening is not even like architecture. It changes all the time and every year. And I think Steve understood that, really, that you had to think of how it was working rather than how it looked now. And for him to understand that, as most clients don't, it's what they see is what they think they've got.
So and she wrote this letter to Steve Jobs, which we have in the archive, and it's much more personal than her books. I mean, again, it's in her lecture notes that you get these jottings in the margin, but the letter to Steve Jobs gives a kind of statement of her favourite gardens, and the books were selling tens of thousands. They're written for quite a prepared audience. I mean, they weren't that, what I'm trying to say is they feel less her than these letters. And she didn't tell the story about how he rang up once and she said she was too busy. And then the thing I find, then he rang back and he said, it's Stephen Jobs.
Made him seem more serious about it, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, like, she's... where did we get to? Sorry, we make these films, and the point is I want people to say that's what she says about that voice, that's her, as you know her, Barbara. And I wanted to capture something so people in the future would say, what was he like, what was she like? And you want them to be able to turn to a film. And really, penultimate point is this, that everyone should have their garden painted. So this is one of the paintings in the Paul Mellon Centre. What can a painting do? A painting can give a structure that a photograph can't. It's very hard to present in a photograph what we see laid out. This is a Welsh garden of the 1640s. Its relationship to landscape, its structure, its rooms.
And of course, in the 1640s, there was no way to catch that view either.
No, exactly.
Right, exactly.
That's a very exactly. So there was no way to, it presents an explanation, if you like, of the garden's form. Roy Strong has done that in his own garden at the Lasket, where he writes about this. It's been photographed 1 million times, but this is a painting commissioned to show the relationships of the spaces.
And perhaps the way the gardener thinks about it, the designer thinks about it, you know, the creator.
I think certainly that one you can see, and there's the personalisation of the painting with the cats and his late wife, and there's also something though about mood and time. And this is John Atkinson Grimshaw, a very successful artist of Leeds in the late 19th century. He has all those photographs of people buttoned up in the mist. He'd just bought this country house, and what it shows us is time within a frame. It shows it rising from the sleeping garden, the old mossy tools, and it shows the new wing he was planning to build. So within one painting, he's given us past, present, future, which I think is a quality. When we garden, our mind is in the present, in the past, in the future. When we think of her in the secret garden, Mary, whatever she's called, she's there now. She's thinking about what will come in the spring. She's thinking about what was past. And a painting can do that. This is a sweet one by an artist called James Patrick. He had just been volunteered in 1940. He was about to set sail overseas, and he painted his wife, his new wife, and their little child. He came back. It's a happy story, but this is a painting. This is the leaving of a garden to go to war. It's in early November. There's a few apples still on the trees. That captures something which no other medium could. This is a painting at the end of the war by Elliot Hodgkin, in which on VE Day he captured the paintings growing in the flowers which had taken root in the rubble. So it's a botanical record. It's also a statement of a new life beginning in 1945. That's another painting by the same artist. And our most recent artist in residence, we had one artist in residence who did the Knott Garden at a time when we had no idea it was going to vanish. We thought it would be there forever. As it's happened, that's become a record of that garden. She painted it, our old garden, over 12. Our new garden, by the way, is also much bigger and stretches out at the front. Our most recent, I mean, it wasn't as if we... our most recent artist, the museum was closed for 2 years for this building project, and she asked 90 people to choose their favourite garden or green space in London, called Eileen Hogan. This is Christopher Gibbs. He chose a cemetery on the King's Road, which you have to enter by climbing the wall. It's an old Jewish cemetery. This is her views of the Chelsea Physic Garden. So she's worked up 12 of these into paintings that are actually going to be exhibited at Yale, which we're very proud of, in 2019.
And they record a moment in time.
They record a moment.
She
kept going back to the Physic Garden, and then I chose this. This is my garden. It's not my garden. This is a football pitch. It's a soccer pitch. For my nomination, 90 of us were asked, and she chose 12. I chose the soccer pitch where my son plays football. Plays soccer by my house. And I think I chose it at 2 points. It shows just the magic of the white line. We think gardens are about plants, but they're as much about boundaries as they're about plants. And just the painting of a white line onto this vast park transforms that space into this theatre for these muddy boys and the parents on the touchline, just that white line. But then we did and rather sweetly, my trustees, as a present from them, not from the museum, as a thank you for the building, they commissioned a second version of this, which I'm very touched by, my lovely trustees. But then I was talking about this, and I also realised that this is also a painting about leaving, because my son has gone to big school, he plays rugby. I don't mean the same. I meet parents who are exactly the same as me in every respect, whereas I used to be on the touchline with the postman, the policeman, and I kind of miss that different culture which it introduced me to. But as he got older, he would turn me away. I mean, he wouldn't let me near the training session, and I would see him vanish across that park. And at first, it's that feeling of, and I won't read it out, but there's a lovely poem by Cecil Day-Lewis, which Eileen then sent me. It's called Letting Go, and it's about watching his son walk away and how loving is letting go. And I realised that you want your boy to be able to run off to play soccer by himself with his friends and not have his father huffing at his side. That's part of, and I used to keep all his, this is my point about loss, I used to keep all his shoes. I had all his shoes from when he was a baby, because I couldn't bear the idea that he wasn't in those shoes anymore. And then one day I just realised that you don't want him in his baby shoes. You want this, he's nearly 6 foot, this boy clumping around in big rugby boots, which he wears my shoes now, because that's what you want. You don't want to be surrounded by old shoes. I kept one pair from the beach. You want him to be clumping around and
you may not want to be surrounded by yesterday's garden.
This is my point. So gardens are also about letting go. And this is the garden of somebody called Tom Stuart Smith, which importantly, well, he's a famous lad, but he's Tom Stuart. He shares it with his wife, who's a psychotherapist and a psychiatrist, and she's written a remarkable book about gardening and therapy, written not just in terms of case studies, but in terms of she uses Michael Pollan a lot. A very thoughtful book. And one of the stories she tells is about waking up one day, and Tom had made a garden at the front that has been photographed in many magazines, and she woke up on a Saturday to the sound of a chainsaw. And Tom and one of their sons was just felling the whole garden. And he came in with split nails with this big smile on his face because he could start again and make a new garden. And I think destruction is part of gardening. Destruction is one of the things that makes us enjoy gardening. As children, it seems an impossibility when your parents prune. You can't believe that the apple tree will grow back.
Right.
We like planting as children. Old people like pruning. That you see them in community gardens. The old people are doing the pruning and the kids are doing the planting. And it's because it's about resilience, it's about new life. And it's also because we know that you have to make choices. If we don't prune the vine, the grapes are going to be bitter.
Right.
So, and
the flower garden is going to be shaded out by the tree, right?
And so that is, adult life is about making decisions and choices. And she finishes with Miss Havisham, who's an example of a depressed person, because she says Miss Havisham should have got out the secateurs. Right. She needs, so I'm summarising her book, but I think gardening also teaches us about how to deal with loss and change. I think it's also one of the things it gives to us. And Sue has all these photographs of her children growing up in her garden. One of the things it gives to us is teaching us how to move on and how to achieve healthy change. And that we can see that in the happy gardeners that we meet. The happy gardener is a changing gardener. The last garden I want to finish with is, because I think it shows, the other thing about gardens, their very durability comes from their ephemerality, which I'll try to explain. There's something about, as you say, the moodiness of a garden that can last. There's something about the spontaneity, in the same way as we can remember an ice cream we had in Florence 30 years ago. the taste of the ice cream on the marble, we can't remember the inscription on the monument or what it said on the label. There are things in gardens that last with us, and an exhibition next spring is of the painter-gardener Cedric Morris, who created at a farmhouse in Suffolk, Benton End. It was an art school. He moved there because his previous art school was burned down by his most famous pupil, Lucian Freud, who was smoking in his bedroom. And they took the plants, and the structure was very simple, but it was the great iris and rose collection. And you would have seen Vita Sackville-West wandering on his iris day. He had pupils. He was he was the son of a baronet from an industrial dynasty. He was a very generous man. He had pupils from his native country of Wales, and he painted and gardened. This is one of his iris masterpieces. The Iris Master, he was called. And these will be in our exhibition. This is him drawing. This is another of his paintings. But the point about, I went to the garden, there's just the walls. There's nothing there, but it's alive. It's alive in the paintings. It's alive in the photographs. It's alive in his pupils, because he taught 30 or 40 pupils. Maggie Hambling is the one who still speaks about him. And it's alive in writing, because it's alive in his plants. This is the poppy that he bred. And it's Beth Chatto's favourite poppy. Beth Chatto was introduced to gardening by Cedric Morris. It's alive in, and it's alive in and Ronald Blythe, who lives in this house, and you won't know this house, but he's 90. Everyone's 96. He's 96, and he was Morris's executor, sorted out his papers, and I go to talk to Ronnie Blythe about Morris, and he wrote this beautiful passage, which is in a book called it's one of my favourite writing pieces. It talks about the whiff of garlic. Ronnie was a young in his 20s in Suffolk. Morris and his partner Let. It was very unusual for two men to live openly in 1940s Suffolk. He said the windows had a hint of Newlyn blue. There were artists who lived in that house. And it's this evocation of this old man. He said he was like a cat. He lived in the present. His garden had become a hayfield, overgrown. I should say Sarah Cook, who was at Sissinghurst, she's collected all of his irises, and part of our exhibition will be a collection of the irises she's found in, you can have a plant executor. She's traced all of the irises that Morris gave away and assembled. There was a Chelsea Flower Show 2 years ago, yeah. And they're beautiful shades of colour. But Ronnie wrote this essay, and Ronnie himself typifies how gardens move on. So Ronnie lives in the house where the painter John Nash moved in 1929, the painter and gardener. He gardens with John Nash's tools, and he just says, it's like he's wearing his overcoat. He says, I'm just looking after John's garden. Yes, yeah. And I was there at Christmas, and he was reading this. He said for Cedric to be alive on a bright day was his... he didn't date his paintings. He said time was a mumble to him. It's a beautiful piece of writing, as I keep saying, so you have to read it. But I was sitting there one day, and Ronnie, on his window, he had a new telephone. He had a panettone because it was Christmas. There was the cat. There was a bowl of apples, and Ronnie was saying, they're from my friends, the Rolfs, who live next door. It was the guy who married Pocahontas. It's the same tree that's been growing. I don't know if it's growing back to the 17th century. Beyond that, he said that was the boundary of the Iceni, that ditch at the end of the garden, which is in pre-Roman times. And on the table with these geraniums, he said, they're cuttings from Cedric's garden. And I had this astonishing sense of time being compressed. The husband of Pocahontas, the Iceni, right. The new telephone, the cat. And then he said to me, is there anything you'd like to take? And in the garden is this greenhouse. Now, this greenhouse belonged to the painter Eric Revilius, who vanished on a flight over Iceland in 1940. And he bequeathed his greenhouse to John Nash. It was re-erected in this garden. And John Nash gardened there, and so did Ronnie. And I said, could I take a pane of the greenhouse? And it's an utterly ordinary piece of glass, but pressed against it are these three gardeners, their plants, a lot of tobacco smoke. And it's propped in the windowsill of my flat as my most precious personal gardening artifact. And I think it shows for us how gardens have this incredible fragility, but in their very openness and transparency, they also have this incredible afterlife. Thank you.
Thank you. I have lots and lots of questions that I want to ask Christopher, but I want to open it up to everyone in the audience. So please stand up and yell if you have a question for Christopher. Yes?
So do you think you'll be able to expand your museum into Lambeth Palace?
The Archbishop might have an opinion.
Right.
We're next door to Lambeth Palace. I mean, the new Archbishop has opened the palace more and more, so in future on a weekly basis we can have joint visits, which hasn't happened before, so people will be able to book both at the same time. We also borrowed recently, which is the Archbishop's tortoise, which lived in that, well, it's dead. It lived in an Archbishop who was crossing the river in the 1620s. There wasn't a bridge, you came across on a ferry. The boat turned over and everything was lost in the river, his possessions, but the tortoise swam to shore. And through Tredescant's lifetime, when Tredescant was living in that neighbourhood, the tortoise munched the grass of Lambeth Palace until in the 18th century, when it was hibernating. The story is a gardener put a fork through it. So we just have the shell and the mummified tortoise, but we had that on display from the Archbishop. It's never left Lambeth Palace for 3 weeks. So it's a strange neighbourliness, which is now becoming, as you imply, a more useful one to visitors.
Is there another question? I just want to ask, oh yes, please, stand, yeah, and yell.
Last night, dinner,
Yeah.
the question was then unresolved. Is garden an art form?
Wow.
Charles-
The question
Charles-
is the question last night was posed at dinner and it was left unresolved, is garden an art form? And I just want to quote one of my board members who describes gardening as the slowest of the performing arts. So, right.
The only reservation, I mean, I think it's used, isn't it, to assert a status. Someone might say the chef is an artist, but the chef might just be a very, very good chef. It doesn't mean that art. I think, Charles Antoine, I think it can give the wrong kind of deference, because there's an ambiguity. So when I went to buy Paula Dietz's book in Barnes & Noble, it's under architecture. Because it's not a how-to book, it's a reflective book about ideas. And so we have these structures imposed on it. In the London Library, which if you know in London, everything has this arcane alphabetical system. So it might say bonsai, Matibiland, Zulu, everything is, and gardening is between, I do not exaggerate, between flagellation and genius. What a good way to resolve that. I only think, Charles, and my personal take on this is I think that if we too easily say we can lose the physicality of gardening. It is a performing art. It's somewhere, I would say, I think it's somewhere between poetry and cookery. I think it's kind of got a place of its own and I quite like the fact that we never quite pin it down.
Well, I also I worked for many years at an art academy, and I found that many of the artists, and I was just speaking to one of the artists who was on the faculty there, and as she has grown older, she has turned much more toward gardening, and away, as you pointed out with other people, away from her other work, which was painting and sculpture. And she said it's the most challenging art that she's ever created, because there's something always pushing back against her. You can't, if you walk away from it, it changes. So. And
I just walked down the High Line to get it. When you look at what Pete did, how a mind can. Pete, he did 25 metres of drawings by hand himself for the High Line. 25 metres. And my friend Tom Piper's here, who's made the film about films. Tom's made the documentary about Pete Aldorf, which is being premiered. But it's a beautiful hour film where which gives us Pete. But how that mind could see, he said, I can see 5, 10, 15 years into the future. He knows every plant. They're not pigments. They're something infinitely more complex. I think the nice thing is most of us do more than one. That's what we. I think the other thing about gardening is, it struck me talking to people this morning actually and last night, is that people move into gardening from architecture, from writing, from engineering, from all sorts of backgrounds, but nobody ever moves back.
Right.
I think that's true, isn't it?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.